A Roman soldier draws back his hand to strike a Jewish peasant across the face. The whole road has stopped to watch. The soldier expects one of two things. The man will cower and run, or the man will swing back and be cut down where he stands. Those are the only two endings this story has ever had. But the peasant does neither. He stands his ground. He turns his head, slowly, and offers the other cheek. And for the first time, the soldier doesn't know what to do with his own hand. For most of our lives, we've been handed that picture as the definition of weakness. Turn the other cheek. Take it. Be a doormat. Let the world walk over you and call it holy. I'll be honest with you. For years I read this verse the same way, and quietly I resented it. It sounded like Jesus was asking the bullied to stay bullied. But what if we've had it backwards the entire time? What if the man offering his other cheek isn't surrendering at all? What if he just took control of the whole situation and the soldier is the one who lost? Because this command hangs on a single Greek word, one word the King James translators flattened into something Jesus may never have meant. And once you see what that word actually carried, turn the other cheek, stops sounding like surrender. It starts sounding like the most disciplined act of defiance in the entire Sermon on the Mount. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will never read this verse the same way again. Let's start with the words everyone skips. In the King James, Matthew chapter 5, verse 39 reads, "But I say unto you, that ye resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also." Resist not evil. That little phrase has done a lot of damage. Read flat. It sounds like Jesus is telling you to let evil have its way. Don't push back. Don't stand up. Just absorb it. And a lot of sincere people have built whole lives of silent suffering on those three English words, believing that was the cost of following him. Here is the problem. The Greek underneath resist is not a soft word at all. The word is anthistēmi. Say it slowly. Anti, against. Histēmi, to stand against. But it isn't the gentle kind of standing against. In the Greek of that century, anthistēmi was a military word. It's the word you'd use for two armies meeting on a field. It's the word for armed rebellion, for taking up the sword and meeting violence with violence in the same currency. So when Jesus says, resist not evil, he is not saying, don't ever oppose evil. He is being far more specific than that. He is saying, do not meet violence with violence. Do not answer the sword with the sword. Do not mirror the evil that is done to you, because the moment you do, you have become a second copy of it. Think about what that means. Jesus isn't forbidding resistance. He's forbidding a particular kind, the kind that turns you into the very thing you're fighting. That's an enormous difference. One reading makes you a doormat. The other makes you a soldier of a completely different kind of war. And the question that should be burning in you right now is simple. If not violence and not surrender, then what? What's the third option? Hold that, because the answer is hiding in a detail almost every English reader walks straight past. And before we get to the cheek, there's one more piece of context that almost everyone misses, and it's sitting right above this verse. Look at what Jesus says immediately before it. Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. We hear that line today, and we wince. It sounds barbaric, like a license for brutal revenge. Take their eye, break their tooth, even the score. But that is almost the opposite of what it originally meant. An eye for an eye comes from the law of Moses. And in the ancient world, it was not a green light for vengeance. It was a leash on it. Think about how feuds actually worked back then. You blind my brother, so I kill your whole family. You break my son's tooth, so I burn your village. Revenge always escalated. The blood debt always grew. An eye for an eye was the law stepping in and saying, no further. The punishment may not exceed the injury. One eye, not a life. One tooth, not a family. It was the first guardrail humanity ever put on the instinct to make them pay tenfold. So watch what Jesus is actually doing. He's not abolishing justice. He takes the oldest limit on revenge that the world had ever known, and he pushes it one radical step further. The law said, Don't take more than was taken from you. Jesus says, what if you refuse to take anything back at all, and instead did something that broke the cycle entirely? That's the setup. Now he needs a concrete example of what breaking the cycle looks like in real life, and that's exactly where the cheek comes in. Now look again at the verse, and this time watch the geography. Whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek. The right cheek. Why does Jesus specify which cheek? Matthew doesn't waste words. That detail is doing something, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Picture it physically. I want you to actually try this in your head. Stand in front of me. I am right-handed, like most people in the ancient world, and overwhelmingly so, in a culture where the left hand was reserved for unclean tasks. Now I want to hit your right cheek. Go ahead and trace the angle. If I use my right hand, there is only one natural way to land a blow on your right cheek. Not a punch, a backhand. That single detail changes everything. Because in the first century world, a backhand was not how you started a fight. A backhand was how a superior disciplined an inferior. It was how a master struck a slave, how a Roman struck a Jew, how a man, in that culture, struck a woman or a child. The backhand wasn't about causing injury. It was about putting someone back in their place. It was a gesture of contempt, a way of saying, you are beneath me, and you will be reminded of it. To really feel the weight of this, you have to understand the world it happened in. The first century Mediterranean was what historians call an honor-shame culture. Honor wasn't a private feeling. It was public currency, more valuable than money. A man's standing, his worth, his ability to be heard and trusted in his own community, all of it lived or died by his public honor. And the fastest way to destroy a person without ever drawing blood was to shame them in front of others. That's what the backhand was for. It wasn't meant to leave a bruise. It was meant to leave a mark on your reputation, to announce to everyone watching that this person could be treated like dirt and do nothing about it. In a world like that, a slap to the face could end a man more thoroughly than a wound. So the scene Jesus paints is not a brawl. It's a humiliation. Somebody with power has just backhanded somebody without it, to shame them in public. And now we can finally ask the right question. When Jesus says, turn the other cheek, what does that actually force the striker to do? Here's the answer, and this is the hinge of the whole teaching. If I've just backhanded your right cheek, and you turn and offer me your left, look at what you've done to my hand. I cannot backhand your left cheek with my right hand. The angle doesn't work. Try it. To strike your left cheek, I now have only two options. I can hit you with the back of my left hand, but in that culture, the left hand was unclean, unthinkable for striking another person in public. Or I have to come at you with my open palm or my fist. And do you understand what that means? A fist, an open-handed strike to the front of the face. That was how you hit an equal. That was how two men of the same standing fought. The instant I'm forced to hit you that way, I have publicly admitted that you are my equal. The whole point of the backhand was to say, you are beneath me. By turning the other cheek, the peasant has stripped that gesture of its entire meaning. He has not thrown a single punch. He has not run. And yet, he has just robbed his oppressor of the one thing the blow was supposed to deliver, his own superiority. That is not weakness. Read it again slowly. That is a man who has discovered that you can refuse to be humiliated without raising a hand. He's saying, with his body, with absolute calm, try again, but you will have to treat me as a human being to do it. He has seized the initiative. He has taken back the power the slap was meant to steal, and he's handed his oppressor a problem the oppressor doesn't know how to solve. I have to be straight with you here, because this channel is about honesty, not just a good story. This reading, The Backhand, The Third Way, has been argued most forcefully by a scholar named Walter Wink, and it has persuaded a great many people. But it is not the only reading, and some scholars push back. They point out that the ancient evidence for the exact social mechanics of the backhand is thinner than we'd like, and that the simpler reading, Jesus calling for genuine, sacrificial non-retaliation, may be closer to the heart of it. I think the honest answer is that both can be true at once. Whether or not every detail of the gesture lands, the shape of what Jesus is teaching is unmistakable. And the next two examples he gives prove it, because they follow the exact same pattern. Watch how Jesus keeps going. The very next verse. If a man sues you and takes your coat, give him your cloak as well. To our ears that sounds like more passivity. Let them take everything. But sit inside the first-century courtroom for a moment. The word for coat here is the inner garment, the tunic worn against the skin. The cloak was the outer robe, and under the law of Moses, a man's cloak could not be kept overnight, because it was the only thing he had to sleep in. It was protected. It was the last thing the law said you could never take from a poor man. So a creditor has dragged a poor man to court over a debt and is stripping him of even his tunic. And Jesus says, give him the cloak too. Hand over the one garment the law itself was protecting. Do you see the move? If you give away your tunic and your cloak, you are now standing in that courtroom completely naked. And here's the cultural knife twist. In Jewish society, the shame of nakedness fell not on the naked person, but on the one who caused it, the one looking. By stripping bare, the poor man turns the whole proceeding into a mirror. He has done nothing illegal. He has simply exposed, in front of everyone, the greed of a system that would take the last thread off a man's back. The debtor has lost his clothes. The creditor has lost his face. And then the third example, maybe the boldest of all. Whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him twain. Go the extra mile. We've turned that into a greeting card phrase about being helpful. The reality had a sword behind it. Under Roman law, a soldier could legally force a civilian, a conquered Jew especially, to carry his military pack. But the law set a hard limit. 1 mile. Exactly 1 Roman mile, and not a step further, because the empire didn't want its soldiers abusing civilians so badly that the provinces revolted. Discipline mattered. A soldier who broke that limit could face punishment from his own commanding officer. Now hear what Jesus says. When the soldier compels you to go 1 mile, go 2. Carry his pack past the marker into the 2nd mile of your own free will. Picture the soldier's face. Suddenly, he's the one in trouble. He's the one nervously asking for his pack back, glancing around to see if an officer noticed. The Jew, the supposed victim, the one with no rights at all, has just flipped the entire power structure with nothing but a refusal to play the assigned role. He's not fighting. He's not fleeing. He's smiling and walking, and the soldier is sweating. And notice, the Jew hasn't broken a single law. He hasn't raised his voice. He's done something far more unsettling than rebellion. He's taken the very act that was meant to degrade him and turned it into a choice that he controls. The moment you choose to carry the pack, it stops being something done to you. It becomes something you decided. And the soldier, who thought he held all the power on that road, suddenly realizes he's holding none of it. 3 examples: the cheek, the cloak, the mile, and every single one follows the identical blueprint. You do not strike back. That would make you a mirror of your oppressor. But you do not crawl away either. Instead, you do something no one expects. You take an action that exposes the injustice, restores your own dignity, and hands the powerful person a problem they cannot solve with force. Walter Wink gave this a name. He called it the third way. Not fight, not flight. A third road that refuses both the fist and the floor. And this is where it stops being ancient history and starts being about your Tuesday afternoon. Because every one of us knows that exact moment. The coworker who talks down to you in front of the team. The family member who has a way of making you feel small at every gathering. The person who has learned that you will always back down and uses it. The voice in your own head that says you have only 2 options. Blow up or swallow it. Fight or be a doormat. And here's something modern research has only recently caught up to. For a long time, we assumed that being humiliated, being socially shamed, was just an emotional thing. Unpleasant, but not real the way a physical injury is real. The science now suggests otherwise. Studies on social rejection have found that the experience of being shamed and excluded lights up some of the very same regions of the brain that register physical pain. Your body, in a real sense, processes humiliation as a kind of wound, which means the ancient world wasn't being dramatic when it treated a public slap as an injury to the soul. They were right. The pain of being made small in front of others is not in your imagination. It is one of the oldest and deepest hurts a human being can carry. And that is exactly why what Jesus offers is so radical. He's not telling you to pretend the wound doesn't hurt. He's handing you a way to keep that wound from defining you. Jesus is standing in front of that false choice and saying, there is a third door. You can refuse to be diminished without becoming cruel. You can keep your dignity without picking up a weapon. You can answer contempt with a steadiness that exposes it for what it is. That is not the posture of a victim. That is the posture of someone who knows exactly who they are and is no longer waiting for permission from the person trying to shame them. And I think that is the part the doormat reading robs from us. It tells the humiliated to stay humiliated and call it godliness. But that was never what he said. The man who turns the other cheek is not surrendering his worth. He is asserting it so completely that the slap loses its power. There is a strength here that has nothing to do with hitting back, and it is available to the smallest, most overlooked person in the room, maybe especially to them. If this is landing on something you've been carrying, a relationship where you felt like you only had two bad options, I genuinely want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments. Even one line. You are not the only one who stood on that road, and there is more dignity available to you than you've been told. Let me bring the threads together, because the pattern is the whole point. We started with 3 English words that have been used to keep people quiet. Resist not evil, and underneath them we found anthistēmi, not a command to let evil win, but a command to refuse evil's own weapons. Don't become a copy of the thing that's hurting you. Then we watched what Jesus actually told the humiliated to do instead, and it wasn't surrender. It was a kind of holy, disciplined defiance. Turn the cheek and force them to see you as human. Give the cloak and expose the greed. Walk the second mile and flip the script on the empire itself. This is the reframe I want you to walk away with. The Sermon on the Mount has been read for centuries as a manual for being nice. It is nothing of the sort. It is a field guide for the powerless on how to keep their souls and their dignity intact under the boot of the powerful, without ever picking up the boot themselves. Jesus didn't tell the oppressed to lie down. He gave them a weapon their oppressors had no defense against, and then he told them it was stronger than the sword. And the strange genius of it is that the powerful never saw it coming, because it didn't look like a weapon at all. It looked like surrender. That's the disguise. The cheek turned, the cloak handed over, the second mile walked. To the world they look like a man giving up. But inside each one is an act of such quiet authority that the person trying to dominate you is left standing there with nothing. That's the secret the doormat reading buried for 2,000 years. So the next time someone quotes "turn the other cheek" at you as a reason to stay silent, to stay small, to take it, you'll know. That verse was never an order to be weak. It was a battle plan for a different kind of strength, the kind that doesn't need to hit back, because it was never in danger of losing itself in the first place. There's one more buried thread in this same sermon, a single word Jesus used that has been mistranslated into one of the most misunderstood commands in the Bible, and it changes what he meant by "be perfect." That's where I'd go next. I'll see you there.